This episode of Listening to Canberra Voices was recorded on campus at the University of Canberra 2023. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, that this land was never ceded. We'd like to extend that respect to First Nations people present and or listening. My name is Caitlin Gibbs. I'll be one of your hosts today for this episode of Listening to Canberra Voices.
And my name is Georgie, and I will be your other host today for Canberra Voices.
And here we have our guest, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
My name is Lynne Simpson, and I came to Canberra in 1959, and I have lived here on and off ever since.
So Lynne is my grandmother, so excuse me if I slip up and call her Grandma Lynne. This episode is going to be focusing on Canberra through time. First off, you came here in 1959.
I did, on a boat, for 6 whole weeks, from the freezing cold of a British winter into the beginning of autumn in Canberra. We left London Tilbury Dock in January, and we sailed past France, Spain, Portugal, through the Straits of Gibraltar to Perth, and then Melbourne, and our final destination was Sydney, where we caught a rickety train all the way to Canberra. My mother was horrified when we got to Canberra. It's this tiny little station with geraniums growing in tubs. And she said to my father, "I thought this was supposed to be the capital." Having come from London, it was a bit of a shock.
Okay, so you started in January and then you came in March?
Yeah, so from January, the end of January to March, we were on the boat.
So you said you went to Melbourne, but you were processed in Sydney.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask why that was? Like, you weren't processed in Melbourne?
Because our final destination was Canberra, I presume. Who knows the workings of Department of Immigration at that time.
I just thought that was interesting, sorry.
Well, I mean, I'm sure that there were people who disembarked in Perth. In fact, we had friends who did that because their family had business in Perth. And there would have been people who disembarked in Melbourne, but we were marked down for Sydney.
Yeah.
Because it was a shorter distance, it was easier to get to. There was a different gauge in the railway between Victoria and New South Wales. So it would have been a more tortuous journey. It was bad enough as it was. We had left England, having got on the train in Manchester, and it was an express train to London. It took 3 hours. We got on the train in Sydney to come to Canberra, the same distance, 180 miles, and it took us 5 hours of bone-shaking rattling.
Well, I mean, the trains have gotten much better at least.
Well, not terribly much. I mean, at least you can walk around on the train.
So why did your family move to Canberra?
Well, it was, employment conditions for my father, I suppose. He had been in Palestine for 6 years during the war. He was a radio operator in the Royal Air Force. And he came back to England and was demobbed, like many men that age. And all he wanted to do was settle down, get married, have a family. And he then had to find some kind of employment. And he ended up teaching drafting in a technical college, and then saw the advertisements for the public service in Canberra. He applied and got the job, and so came to Australia as a patent officer looking at mechanical structural engineering issues. And of course we came with him.
So what was Canberra like when you arrived?
It was tiny. I mean, we had lived in Manchester, a very big, bustling city with many, many services, a really fantastic intercity network of transport, hospitals, the whole works. And we came to Canberra. Canberra was divided into two by the Molonglo Creek. and there was a rickety wooden bridge where Commonwealth Avenue Bridge is now, over the creek. When it rained heavily, it flooded, and people had to go from Barton to the north side through Queanbeyan because there was no other way of getting across. So the population of Canberra was composed then of public servants, many of whom had tertiary education, and their families who were relatively young. Immigrant workers from both Greece and Italy as well as England who were building the houses, and university people who were coming to stock the ANU. My sister quite quickly made friends with a girl who lived around the corner, and her father was a sub-editor of the Canberra Times. I went into 6th class because I was 11. I went into Lynham High the following year as I think the third intake of students. So it was interesting. Plus, of course, the non-English speaking background people tended to stick together. Most of the English speaking background people would have gatherings inside each other's houses. In fact, that was where most of our social meetings took place.
What was the land like at that time?
Well, I mean, apart from Canberra itself, where, of course, we're British, and so we had to have blossom trees and deciduous trees everywhere. Once you got outside the boundary, it was all just bush. And, of course, so very, very different to what I was used to. I mean, I lived basically in a concrete jungle. And all of a sudden there's all this wide open space and room to run and, it was amazing.
Would you say it's changed much since then?
Oh, I would, because we're talking about a time when people had quarter-acre blocks, and now it's much, much smaller. I mean, if you have a quarter-acre block, then you're being encouraged to have another house on it. So there's a huge amount of infill. And, I mean, things like, they cut all the gum trees down along Northbourne Avenue, didn't they? To accommodate the railway. And, I mean, sure, they planted new ones, but it's not quite the same. And certainly, I mean, you could go up to the top of Red Hill or Mount Ainslie, especially in autumn, and all you would see is just a mass of colour. People tended to have big gardens. Now they don't, because they live inside all the time and play on computers. I mean, now you can talk to the next door neighbour through the kitchen window. You could even shake hands in some places.
And of course, everything's being torn down and replaced by apartment buildings.
Well, this is true too. Yes, I mean, the skyline was very flat. Yes, I mean, there was the Sydney building and the Melbourne building and Civic. East Row and West Row were also built. The mall was not there. There was no Canberra Theatre. That was all just open parkland. And there was no lake. I remember that.
What?
No lake.
What? Did the lake just appear?
No, and in fact, I believe I worked at Sydney University much later for one of the people who helped design Scrivener Dam and the Commonwealth Avenue Bridge. Yeah, that was built. The Queen Mother was supposed to be coming out to open the lake, and there was all panic on because we hadn't had rain. There was no lake. Fortunately or unfortunately, I believe now it appears that she might have had some form of cancer and was operated on and couldn't come sort of last minute. So the whole thing was delayed. In the meantime, we had rain. And so we'd watched all of the walls being built and the land being cleared. And then all of a sudden, almost overnight, we had a lake.
That's so odd to think about. Your parents were both involved in the developing theatre scene.
They were. My father loved to sing, and he had an exceptionally good voice. And we arrived in Canberra in 1959, and one of his colleagues at the patent's office was a leading light in the Canberra Philharmonic Society. His name was Baz Penny, and he used to take comic leads. He was really quite a funny man. And he managed to convince Dad that we should go and experience this kind of thing. And so we went, everybody dressed up in their best, to the Riverside buildings. Now, the Riverside buildings originally had been built as a hostel for immigrant builders. Once the initial flush of buildings was finished, these buildings were then turned over to Canberra Society for use if they wished. So you had things like the Boy Scouts and the Red Cross and all those kinds of people. Canberra Rep had 3 of these buildings. We arrive, and of course, all the embassy people are going to the theatre. And they're all dressed, the ladies, in minks and diamonds and the whole routine, sitting on these form benches on rather dicey platforms, enjoying the best that Canberra Rep had to offer. Eventually, of course, Canberra Rep migrated to the auditorium at the old Canberra High School in Acton, and then from there to Theatre 3, where they are now. And they have always been extremely active in presenting mainly drama, but they also branched out into an old-time music hall as well, which ran for quite some time, from about 74 to the late 2000s. They're still very active. And they've been going since, I think, 1932. And then the Philharmonic had a show. I think it was The Merry Widow. And we went to see that too. And that was in the Albert Hall, which was the only place for meetings like this to occur, other than the repertory in the prefab building. Dad, of course, could not resist. He had to join. And the first production that he joined, he was in the chorus of the Mikado, in which he starred twice more in his musical career, and less like a Japanese courtier you never saw, because he was 6'4" and had a big beaky nose. But anyway, my mother also was in the chorus, and so she became thoroughly involved in costumes. From 1960, they both were involved in theatre the whole time that they were in Canberra, from then on. Eventually, of course, they went into the Canberra Theatre, and my father actually produced the first Gilbert and Sullivan that went into the theatre, which was Yeoman of the Guard. And I can remember the first time we went into the theatre, which had a whole 1,200 seats at that point. We went into the theatre, and he said, right, I want to test the acoustics. So okay. So there's my sister, my mother and I, as well as the cast and all their families and things. But he said, I want each of you to be in different positions in the theatre and let me know what it sounds like. And he stood there, centre stage, no lights, no amplification, no music, no nothing, and sang.
That's beautiful.
And he could fill that theatre with music. I was very proud of him.
And obviously our audience at home can't see this, but when you were telling that story, you closed your eyes, and I think I can imagine you imagining it.
What do you think have been the biggest changes in Canberra's culture?
Well, I mean, obviously the population has grown enormously, and the services have grown enormously, and the expectations have grown enormously as well. I mean, we now have 3 universities in the city. We have a far-flung population and a far greater multicultural mix, I would say. I mean, you only have to look at the spread of dining facilities, for example, to understand just how varied the population is. And of course now we're getting international shows coming. And during my father's time, for example, the Australian Opera was formed, and then they began to come to Canberra, and so high opera, was able to be performed because the audience were wanting more and more. We've also had an increase in the number of embassies, and so they're prepared to bring people in as well. So yeah, it's much more varied.
So it went from a village, basically.
Well, I wouldn't say we're a huge city, but we're a city. We don't have a thriving nightlife, or at least not for people my age anyway.
We're getting there, though.
Well, maybe so. It depends what kind of a thriving nightlife you want. But
I want to thank you so much for all of this. I didn't have many questions, but I think it's because you're such an amazing storyteller. I don't want to call it storytelling, but I don't know, I just found myself imagining Canberra back then from how you described it, and even your travels to Australia. I thought it was absolutely amazing, and seeing you say this with so much enthusiasm and so much love was amazing, and I've got so much appreciation for Canberra now. All things I didn't know, but I'm not from Canberra, so...
This is my life. But yes, thank you so much, Lynne, for coming and doing this, and thank you for listening.